So you just bought yourself a new camera, and it's finally a step up from your old camera, which was at that point your cell phone, or it was a point and shoot with an extendable zoom lens that was just fine for your purposes. And then you realized that you didn't have the freedom that you wanted to be able to have. Today we're talking about how to use your camera, and hopefully we'll keep it super short. Let's get started. There are three things that you need to think about to make a good photo. There is exposure, there's focusing, which is like kind of just very specific, and there is also composition. Those three things either make or break a photograph. I'm not gonna waste your time, so I'm gonna get started with exposure right now. Exposure is a measure of how light or dark your image is. So if I change my camera settings so that one of the three things that affects this exposure is vastly changing my exposure to make it too dark, then the image comes out too dark. If I change it the opposite direction and it comes out too light, plus it looks a little bit off. But when I set it to exactly the right place, the image looks deep and rich, and it's not either over or underexposed. There's a little meter on your camera that tells you how exposed your photo is, and you want it to be generally in the middle. Now, of course, you can put it lower or higher to give certain effects, but to take basic photographs, you're going to put that right smack in the middle. There are three things that affect the exposure of your photograph. Number one is the shutter speed. The shutter speed is how fast the image is exposed. If you have a super fast shutter speed, then the motion is captured and there's no or little blur. So if I'm trying to take a photograph of a hummingbird, I'm gonna want a shutter speed of like a 2,000th of a second to freeze it in air. However, if I want the hummingbird to have a little more blur in its wings, then I'm going to set the shutter speed down to maybe 1,000th or 500th of a second. Now these are really fast shutter speeds, but hummingbirds are really fast creatures. A 60th of a second is a good place to start, and you can change it from there depending on what your preferences are. Shutter speed is basically how long you leave the shutter open, but the thing is that if you have a slower shutter speed, so maybe a 1/5 of a second instead of a 60th, you're going to get a lot more light than if you have a faster shutter speed such as a 100th or 200th of a second. Now there's another thing that you can do to adjust that, and that is using the aperture. I actually have a lens right here to show you exactly what the aperture does. The aperture is the small hole inside your lens that allows you to focus the light, either just on your subject or on your subject and the foreground and the background. If you're taking giant landscapes, then you want your foreground and background to be in focus, as much of it as possible. But if you're taking portraits, you kind of want that background to become irrelevant and blur away. So a small aperture is a small hole in the lens. It lets very little light through. It can compensate for longer exposures and long shutter speeds. If you open the aperture up so it's super wide, you can compensate for super fast shutter speeds that let very little light in. That is where the third thing comes in, which is ISO. ISO is basically adding artificial light to all of the pixels in your scene. However, because your camera isn't perfect, and no camera is, adding a higher number of ISO will basically just degrade the quality of your image. So if you want to be shooting with a short shutter speed and a small aperture, then you can bump your ISO up to a larger number. But because it is amplifying the signals that it receives, there is some amount of imperfections in that, and so you get what is called noise, which are pixels that don't quite line up with the rest of the image. So you'll get pixels that are out, or it'll just be a grainy image in general. So if you want good quality images, you want to keep your ISO at around 800 or lower. You can bump it up higher, but that will slightly degrade your crispness of your image. Now that you know how to adjust the exposure on your camera in full manual mode, you can take that creative freedom that it gives you and put that however you want. So if you want an image to be dark and moody, then adjust your settings so that the image comes out dark and moody. If you want something to be bright, then open your aperture up, or slow down your shutter speed, or bump up your ISO, and it will come out brighter. From this point on, it's all up to you. The second thing that we're going to talk about today is focusing. So there are three ways of focusing. There's full auto in servo AF, which basically just tracks the subject whenever you hold the shutter button down. There is automatic with single frame autofocus, which when you hold the shutter button down, it focuses and stays there. And then there is full manual focusing, which I have to use on my old Minolta lenses with my Canon camera. If your subject is moving around a lot, then you're going to want to use servo AF. It might be called something different in your camera, but basically it will track the subject even when you're holding the shutter button down. If you're shooting portraits where the subject is not moving a lot, you can use single frame autofocus. It'll put your subject's face in focus, or whatever you touch to make that point in focus on your screen, and it will keep it there, and you can click and it will be in focus. Now, manual focus is not generally used, but I do like to use it when my camera has trouble focusing. So you can adjust this by twisting something on your lens, and you would switch over to manual focus either by clicking a switch on your lens or hitting a button on your camera, and you can adjust the focus through your lens. And that will basically allow you to focus on whatever you want, but you can't do it super quick. If you want to focus on something that hasn't entered the frame yet, then you can put somebody there or something there and focus on that with manual focus and then stay in your position, and then you can, once that thing passes through the frame, you can click away and you can be guaranteed that it will be in focus. Let's recap. If your subject is moving around a lot, you're going to want to use servo AF, or it might be called something different. If you want to capture an image of something that is going to stay in one place, then you can use one-shot AF. And if you want to capture an image of something that is hard for the camera to focus on or hasn't entered the frame yet, you can manually focus, and then when you're ready, you can take your photo. Now, there's one last thing that I don't have a ton of experience in, but that's composition of your photos. You want to make your photos look good in the framing of them and in the positioning of elements in your frame. There are a bunch of different techniques to this, but a few that I can name off right now are the rule of thirds. If you divide the image into thirds, both vertically and horizontally, you can place your subject in one of those lines and you should be good to go. Now, there are two ways of thinking about this. You can either fill the frame with your subject like I am doing right now, or you can leave it and have a bunch of empty space which draws your attention to the subject of the photo. There are a ton of different ways to think about composition, and I'm gonna leave that up to you. I don't have time to put it all in this video, so go do your own research. It's not a terribly difficult subject to get a basic grasp of. Now, one last thing, if you're making videos, set your frame rate to whatever you want it to be. I would recommend 24 frames per second, and then set your shutter speed to double that. You can change your other settings to make your exposure good, but making your shutter speed double your frame rate will improve your quality of your videos because it seems just a little bit more natural. Now, that's all I have to say about using your camera. There's a ton more for you to learn, but you don't have to learn it right now. You can learn about it all later in your own research, but this hopefully is enough to get you started. Now, click away from the video, close down your computer, and go start playing with your camera.